A tithe is a 1/10 part of something paid as a contribution to a religious organization, a compulsory tax to government. Today, tithes are normally voluntary and paid in cash, checks, or stocks, whereas historically tithes were required and paid in kind, such as agricultural products. Several European countries operate a formal process linked to the tax system, allowing some churches to assess tithes. Traditional Jewish law and practice has included various forms of tithing since ancient times. Orthodox Jews commonly practice maser kesefim. In modern Israel, Jews continue to follow the laws of agricultural tithing, e.g. Maser Rishon, Teramat Maser, and Maser Sheni. In Christianity, some interpretations of biblical teachings conclude that although tithing was practiced extensively in the Old Testament, it was never practiced or taught within the first-century church. Instead, the New Testament scriptures are seen as teaching the concept of free will offerings as a means of supporting the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7. Also, some of the earliest groups sold everything they had and held the proceeds in common to be used for the furtherance of the gospel. Acts chapter 2 verses 44 to 47, Acts chapter 4 verses 34 to 35. Further, Acts chapter 5 verses 1 to 20 contains the account of a man and wife who were living in one of these groups. They sold a piece of property and donated only part of the selling price to the church, but claimed to have given the whole amount and immediately fell down and died when confronted by the Apostle Peter over the dishonesty. Tithes were mentioned at the Council of Tours in 567 and the Synod of Macon in 585. They were formally recognized under Pope Adrian I in 787. Ancient Near East. None of the extant laws of the ancient Near East deal with tithing, although other secondary documents show that it was a widespread practice in the ancient Near East. William W. Hello recognizes comparisons for Israel with its ancient Near Eastern environment. However, as regards tithes, comparisons with other ancient Near Eastern evidence is ambiguous, and ancient Near Eastern literature provides scant evidence for the practice of tithing and the collection of tithes. The Ezrite, the Ugarit and Babylonian 1/10 tax, listed below are some specific instances of the Mesopotamian tithe, taken from the Assyrian Dictionary of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, Volume 4 E. Pag. 369. The palace has taken 8 garments as your tithe. 11 garments as tithe. Shamash demands the tithe. 4 minas of silver, the tithe of Bel, Nabu, and Nergal. He has paid, in addition to the tithe for Ninurta, the tax of the gardener. The tithe of the chief accountant, he has delivered it to Shamash. Why do you not pay the tithe to the lady of Uruk? O's barley and dates as balance of the tithe of the years 3 and 4. The tithe of the king on barley of the town. With regard to the elders of the city, whom has summoned to tithe. The collector of the tithe of the country summoned who is in charge of the tithe. Hebrew Bible. Hebrew is a Semitic language, related to Akkadian, the lingua franca of that time. Patriarchs in Genesis chapter 14 verses 18 to 20. Abraham, after rescuing Lot, met with Melchizedek. After Melchizedek's blessing, Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything he has obtained from battle. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise Praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. In Genesis chapter 28 verses 12 to 22, Jacob, after his visionary dream of Jacob's ladder and receiving a blessing from God, promises God a tenth. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So early in the morning Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you." Mosaic law. The tithe is specifically mentioned in the books of Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. The tithe system was organized in a 3-year cycle, corresponding to the Shemitah cycle. These tithes were in reality more like taxes for the people of Israel and were mandatory, not optional giving. This tithe was distributed locally within thy gates to support the Levites and assist the poor. Every year, Bikurim, Terumah, Mazzah, Rishon and Teremat Mazzah were separated from the grain, wine and oil. The first tithe is giving of 1/10 of agricultural produce to the Levite. Historically, during the First Temple period, the first tithe was given to the Levites. Approximately at the beginning of the Second Temple construction, Ezra and his Beth Din implemented its giving to the Kohanim. Unlike other offerings which were restricted to consumption within the tabernacle, the second tithe could be consumed anywhere. On years 1, 2, 4 and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, God commanded the children of Israel to take a second tithe that was to be brought to the place of the temple. The owner of the produce was to separate and bring 1/10 of his finished produce to the old city of Jerusalem after separating Terumah and the first tithe. But if the family lived too far from Jerusalem, the tithe could be redeemed upon coins. Then, the Bible required the owner of the redeemed coins to spend the tithe to buy whatever you like: cattle, sheep, wine or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Implicit in the commandment was an obligation to spend the coins on items meant for human consumption. In years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, the Israelites set aside the tithe instead as the poor tithe, and it was given to the strangers, orphans, and widows. The Levites, also known as the tribe of Levi, were descendants of Levi. They were assistants to the Aaronic priests and did not own or inherit a territorial patrimony. The function in society was that of temple functionaries, teachers and trusted civil servants who supervised the weights and scales and witnessed agreements. The goods donated from the other Israeli tribes were the source of sustenance. They received from all Israel a tithe of food or livestock for support, and in turn would set aside a 10th portion of that tithe for the Aaronic priests. An additional tithe mentioned in the book of Leviticus is the cattle tithe, which is to be sacrificed as a korban at the temple in Jerusalem. United Kingdom of Israel LMLK seals may represent the oldest archaeological evidence of tithing. About 10% of the storage jars manufactured during Hezekiah's reign were stamped. See 2 Chronicles chapters 29 to 31 for a record of this early worship reformation. The book of Nehemiah also talks about the collection of tithes to Leviim and distribution of terumah to the priests. Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 5. People were actually appointed to collect mandatory tithes and place them in specially designated chambers, which eventually came to be known as storehouses. Nehemiah chapter 12 verse 44. Minor Prophets. The book of Malachi has one of the most quoted biblical verses about tithing. Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you said, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts. If I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need, I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruits of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not fail to bear, says the Lord of hosts. Then all nations will call you blessed, for you will be a land of delight, says the Lord of hosts. Deuterocanonical. The Deuterocanonical book of Tobit provides an example of all three classes of tithes practiced during the Babylonian captivity. I would often go by myself to Jerusalem on religious holidays, as the law commanded for every Israelite for all time. I would hurry off to Jerusalem and take with me the early produce of my crops, a tenth of my flocks, and the first portion of the wool cut from my sheep. I would present these things at the altar to the priests, the descendants of Aaron. I would give the first tenth of my grain, wine, olive oil, pomegranates, figs, and other fruit to the Levites who served in Jerusalem. For 6 out of 7 years, I also brought the cash equivalent of the second tenth of these crops to Jerusalem, where I would spend it every year. I gave this to orphans and widows, and to Gentiles who had joined Israel. In the 3rd year, when I brought and gave it to them, we would eat together according to the instruction recorded in Moses' law, as Deborah my grandmother had taught me. Judaism. Orthodox Jews continue to follow the laws of Terumah and Massah, as well as the custom of tithing 10% of one's earnings to charity. Due to doubts concerning the status of persons claiming to be Kohanim or Leviim arising after severe Roman, Christian persecutions and exile, the Hebrew Bible tithe of 10% for the Levites, and tithe of 10% for the priests are dealt with in accordance with Jewish law. The Mishnah and Talmud contain analysis of the first tithe, second tithe and fourth tithe. Animals are not tithed in the present era when the temple is not standing. Christianity. Many Christians support the churches and pastors with monetary contributions of one sort or another. Frequently these monetary contributions are called tithes, whether or not they actually represent 10% of anything. Some claim that as tithing was an ingrained Jewish custom by the time of Jesus, but no specific command to tithe appears in the New Testament. For Catholics, the payment of tithes was adopted from the Old Law, and early writers speak of it as a divine ordinance and as an obligation of conscience, rather than any direct command by Jesus Christ. Some Protestants cite Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 23 verse 23 in support of tithing, while others see it as a denunciation of false piety. Away with you, you pettifogging Pharisee lawyers! You give to God a tenth of herbs, like mint, dill, and cumin, but the important duties of the law, judgment, mercy, honesty, you have neglected. Yet these you ought to have performed, without neglecting the others. And its parallel, Luke chapter 11 verse 42. Woe to you, Pharisees! You tithe mint and rue and every edible herb, but disregard justice and the love of God. These were rather the things one should practice, without neglecting the others. Another mention of tithing in the New Testament appears in Hebrews chapter 7 verses 1 to 10. This refers back to the tithe Abram paid to Melchizedek. Whether as generosity or as a letter of the law, tenth is not mentioned. New Testament discussion promotes giving and does not mention tithing. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7 talks about giving cheerfully. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 12 encourages giving what you can afford. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verses 1 to 2 discusses giving weekly. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 17 to 18 exhorts supporting the financial needs of Christian workers. Acts chapter 11 verse 29 promotes feeding the hungry wherever they may be, and James chapter 1 verse 27 states that pure religion is to help widows and orphans. Orthodox Christianity. Tithing in medieval Eastern Christianity did not spread so widely as in the West. A constitution of the emperors Leo I and Anthemius apparently expected believers to make voluntary payments and forbade compulsion. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints bases its tithing on the following additional scriptures: "And this shall be the beginning of the tithing of my people, and after that, those who have thus been tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, and this shall be a standing law unto them forever, for my holy priesthood, saith the Lord." And it was this same Melchizedek to whom Abraham paid tithes. Yea, even our father Abraham paid tithes of 1/10 part of all he possessed. Tithing is currently defined by the Church as payment to the Church of 1/10 of one's annual income. Many LDS leaders have made statements in support of tithing. Every Latter-day Saint receives an opportunity once a year to meet with the bishop about their tithing settlement. The payment of tithes is mandatory for members to receive the priesthood or obtain admission to temples. None of the funds collected from tithing is paid to church officials. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a lay ministry. The money that is voluntarily given is used to build and maintain church buildings as well as to further the work of the church. Islam. Zakat or almsgiving. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is the giving of a small percentage of one's assets to charity. It serves principally as the welfare contribution to poor and deprived Muslims, although others may have a rightful share. It is the duty of an Islamic state not just to collect zakat but to distribute it fairly as well. Zakat is payable on 3 kinds of assets: wealth, production, and animals. The more well-known zakat on wealth is 2.5% of accumulated wealth, beyond one's personal needs. Production is subject to a 10% or 5% zakat, or 1/10, using the rule that if both labor and capital are involved, 5% rate is applied. If only one of the two are used for production, then the rate is 10%. For any earnings that require neither labor nor capital, like finding underground treasure, the rate is 20%. The rules for zakat on animal holdings are specified by the type of animal group and tend to be fairly detailed. Muslims fulfill this religious obligation by giving a fixed percentage of the surplus wealth. Zakat has been paired with such a high sense of righteousness that it is often placed on the same level of importance as performing the 5 daily, repetitive ritualized prayer. Muslims see this process also as a way of purifying themselves from their greed and selfishness and also safeguarding future business. In addition, zakat purifies the person who receives it because it saves him from the humiliation of begging and prevents him from envying the rich. Because it holds such a high level of importance, the punishment for not paying when able is very severe. In the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam it states, "The prayers of those who do not pay zakat will not be accepted." This is because without zakat a tremendous hardship is placed on the poor which otherwise would not be there. Besides the fear of the prayers not getting heard, those who are able should be practicing this 3rd pillar of Islam because the Quran states that this is what believers should do. Non-Muslims living in an Islamic state are required to pay jizya. This exempts them from military service and they do not pay zakat. Sikhism. Daswan, sometimes spelled Dasvan, is the 1/10 part of one's income that should be donated in the name of the God. According to Sikh principles, church collection of religious offerings and taxes England and Wales. The right to receive tithes was granted to the English churches by King Ethelwulf in 855. The Saladin tithe was a royal tax, but assessed using ecclesiastical boundaries. In 1188, the legal validity of the tithe system was affirmed under the Statute of Westminster of 1285. The dissolution of the monasteries led to the transfer of many rights to tithe to secular landowners and the crown, and tithes could be extinguished until 1577 under an Act of the 37th year of Henry VIII's reign. Adam Smith criticized the system in The Wealth of Nations, arguing that a fixed rent would encourage peasants to farm more efficiently. See below for a fuller description and history until the reforms of the 19th century. Written by Sir William Blackstone and edited by other learned lawyers of the period, the system gradually ended with the Tithe Commutation Act 1836, whose long-lasting tithe commission replaced them with a commutation payment, land award and/or run charges to those paying the commutation payment, and took the opportunity to map out residual chancel liability where the rectory had been appropriated during the medieval period by a religious house or college. Its records give a snapshot of land ownership in most parishes. The tithe files are a socio-economic history resource. The rolled-up payment of several years' tithe would be divided between the tithe owners as at the date of their extinction. This commutation reduced problems to the ultimate payers by effectively folding tithes in with rents. However, it could cause transitional money supply problems by raising the transaction demand for money. Later, the decline of large landowners led tenants to become freeholders and again have to pay directly. This also led to renewed objections of principle by non-Anglicans. It also kept intact a system of chancel repair liability affecting the minority of parishes where the rectory had been lay appropriated. The precise land affected in such places hinged on the content of documents such as the content of deeds of merger and apportionment maps. Tithe redemption. Run charges in lieu of abolished tithe paid by landowners were converted by a public outlay of money under the Tithe Act 1936 into annuities paid to the state through the Tithe Redemption Commission. Such payments were transferred in 1960 to the Board of Inland Revenue, and those remaining were terminated by the Finance Act 1977. The Tithe Act 1951 established a compulsory redemption of English tithes by landowners where the annual amounts payable were less than £1, so abolishing the bureaucracy and costs of collecting small sums of money. France. In France, the tithes, called le dime, were a land tax. Originally a voluntary tax, the dime became mandatory in 1585. In principle, unlike the tithe, the dime was levied on both noble and non-noble lands. The dime was divided into a number of types, including the grosses dimes, menus or vertes dimes, dimes to charnage. Although the term dime comes from the Latin decima, the dime rarely reached this percentage and it was closer to 1/13 of the agricultural production. The dime was originally meant to support the local parish, but by the 16th century many dimes went directly to distant abbeys, monasteries, and bishops, leaving the local parish impoverished, and this contributed to general resentment. In the Middle Ages, some monasteries also offered the dime in homage to local lords in exchange for the protection, but this practice was forbidden by the Lateran Council of 1179. All religious taxes were constitutionally abolished in 1790 in the wake of the French Revolution. Greece. There has never been a separate church tax, a mandatory tithe on Greek citizens. The state pays the salaries of the clergy of the established Church of Greece in return for use of real estate, mainly forestry, owned by the church. The remainder of church income comes from voluntary, tax-deductible donations from the faithful. These are handled by each diocese independently. Ireland tithes were introduced after the Norman conquest of 1169 to 1172, and were specified in the papal bull Laudabilita as a duty to ... pay yearly from every house the pension of 1 penny to St. Peter, and to keep and preserve the rights of the churches in that land whole and inviolate. However, collection outside the Norman area of control was sporadic. From the English Reformation in the 16th century, most Irish people chose to remain Roman Catholic and had by now to pay tithes valued at about 10% of an area's agricultural produce, to maintain and fund the established state church, the Anglican Church of Ireland, to which only a small minority of the population converted. Irish Presbyterians and other minorities like the Quakers and Jews were in the same situation. The collection of tithes was violently resisted in the period 1831 to 36, known as the Tithe War. Thereafter, tithes were reduced and added to rents with the passing of the Tithe Commutation Act in 1836. With the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland by the Irish Church Act 1869, tithes were abolished. United States. While the federal government has never collected a church tax, a mandatory tithe on its citizens, states collected a tithe into the early 19th century. Today, such a tax is prohibited by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The United States and its governmental subdivisions also exempt most churches from payment of income tax of the Internal Revenue Code and similar state statutes, which also allows donors to claim the donations as an income tax itemized deduction. Also, churches may be permitted exemption from other state and local taxes such as sales and property taxes, either in whole or in part. However, churches are required to withhold federal and state income tax from their employees along with the employees' share of Social Security and Medicare taxes, and pay the employer's share of the latter two taxes, unless the employee is an ordained, licensed, or commissioned minister. Spain and Latin America both a tithe, a levy of 10% on all agricultural production, and first fruits, an additional harvest levy, were collected in Spain throughout the medieval and early modern periods for the support of local Catholic parishes. The tithe crossed the Atlantic with the Spanish Empire. However, the Indians, who made up the vast majority of the population in colonial Spanish America, were exempted from paying tithes on native crops such as corn and potatoes that they raised for their own subsistence. After some debate, Indians in colonial Spanish America were forced to pay tithes on the production of European agricultural products, including wheat, silk, cows, pigs, and sheep. The tithe was abolished in several Latin American countries, including Mexico, soon after independence from Spain. The tithe was abolished in Spain itself in 1841, and in Argentina in 1826.